There is a particular kind of person who is always suspected in some quiet corner of their awareness that everyone else received a set of instructions for living that they somehow never got. Not a manual for practical things, not how to pay taxes or make conversation at a party, but something deeper, something about how to want what the culture wants, how to feel satisfied by what the culture calls satisfying, how to move through the ordinary architecture of daily life without the persistent, low-grade sense that something essential is being lost in translation. They are, in many ways, among the most perceptive people in any room. They notice things, not with the cool precision of an analyst, but with the whole body, the whole nervous system, the whole interior life pressed quietly against the glass of experience. They feel what others have barely named. They see what most people are not yet looking at. And yet, for all of this perceptive richness, they often end the day feeling more alone than anyone around them seemed to be. Because to be deeply seen requires first being accurately perceived, and that specific, rare event may have happened for them only a handful of times in an entire life. If something in what you have just heard feels less like description and more like recognition, if it arrived not as information but as relief, then what you are feeling is the particular quietness of being accurately named. What has just been described is the foundational experience of the INFP personality type, and this video is an attempt, careful, unhurried, grounded in serious psychology, to explain not just what that experience is, but precisely why it happens and what it means. Let us begin at the beginning, not with a personality quiz or a list of traits, but with the actual architecture of the INFP mind. In 1921, the Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung published Psychological Types, a work that would quietly reshape how Western psychology understood the interior life of human beings. In it, Jung proposed that the differences between people were not simply matters of temperament or upbringing, but of cognitive orientation, deep structural differences in how the psyche processes experience, constructs meaning, and relates to the world. He described 8 fundamental psychological types, each characterized by a dominant function, thinking, feeling, sensation, or intuition, expressed in either an introverted or extroverted direction. The type Jung described as the Introverted Feeling type, and what later typologists would come to call the INFP, he characterized with striking precision. Mostly silent, he wrote, inaccessible, hard to understand, guided by subjective feeling, true motives generally concealed. Jung was not pathologizing this type, he was naming something real, that the introverted feeling function operates as a kind of sovereign inner world, one that is rich, rigorously organized, and almost entirely visible from the outside. Decades later, Isabel Briggs Myers and her mother, Catherine Cook Briggs, took Jung's framework and developed what became the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator, a practical instrument for identifying these cognitive orientations in living populations. The INFP in Myers' original typology descriptions was characterized as someone who brings extraordinary dedication to what they believe in, who is drawn to work involving personal values, and who possesses a depth of feeling that is rarely visible to others, precisely because it is so intensely interior. According to data from the Myers and Briggs Foundation, the INFP type represents approximately 4 to 4.5% of the global population. Some methodologies place the figure slightly lower, others slightly higher, but the consensus is consistent. This is one of the rarer configurations of human consciousness, present in perhaps 1 in 25 people across cultures and demographics. 4%. Consider what that means in practice. In a classroom of 30 children, there may be 1 INFP. In a corporate team of 20, perhaps none. In a family of 4, the statistical probability that any other member shares this cognitive architecture is extremely small. This rarity is not incidental to the INFP experience. It is one of its constituent features. The INFP's dominant cognitive function is introverted feeling, what Jungians abbreviate as FI. And the auxiliary function, the second in command, is extraverted intuition, abbreviated NE. These two functions working in concert create a mind of extraordinary depth and extraordinary range. The FI provides a fixed, unwavering interior compass of values, not rules absorbed from outside, but a living moral and aesthetic universe constructed entirely from the inside. The NE generates a perpetual awareness of possibility, patterns across ideas, connections across domains, futures branching from every present moment. Together, they constitute a mind that is simultaneously anchored and perpetually mobile, a mind that is ferociously loyal to what it believes to be true and perennially restless in its search for what else might be true. It is not a simple architecture to live inside. But here is what most people miss about the INFP's inner world. It is not a retreat from reality. It is a more demanding engagement with it. To understand what actually happens inside the INFP's mind, we need to take the concept of introverted feeling seriously. Not as a metaphor for being emotional, but as a precise description of a cognitive process. FI, as Jung described it in Psychological Types, is a valuation function. It does not simply register emotion the way a thermometer registers temperature. It constructs, it organizes experience into a layered internal moral and aesthetic architecture, a universe of meaning that is entirely self-referencing, self-sustaining, and self-correcting. The INFP does not feel things and then decide what they mean. The feeling and the meaning arrive simultaneously, already fused, already evaluated, already placed in relation to everything else they have ever experienced. This is not sentimentality. That is a critical distinction. The popular image of the INFP as a weepy dreamer drifting through life on clouds of romantic feeling misses the mark entirely. What FI actually produces is something closer to a philosopher's precision, a precision that operates through emotional register rather than logical sequence. The INFP who tells you they feel something is wrong with a situation is not being irrational. They are reporting data from a system that integrates moral complexity at speeds that explicit reasoning cannot match. The consequence of this architecture is what might be called value congruence and its violation. When an INFP is asked to act in ways that contradict their internal value system, the response is not merely psychological discomfort, it is physiological. Elaine Aron's research on highly sensitive persons, published in The Highly Sensitive Person in 1996, established that individuals with heightened sensory processing sensitivity, a trait that overlaps significantly with FI-dominant types, show measurably different neurological responses to stimuli that conflict with their values or sense of self. The body registers the violation before the mind has fully articulated what has been violated. This is not weakness. This is a nervous system calibrated to a finer resolution. Consider a young girl. Let us call her Mara. She is 7 years old. She is sitting at a school lunch table, and she has just said something true, something she perceived clearly and stated plainly, and the room has laughed. Not cruelly, simply with the easy dismissal that children who have already learned the social contract extend toward those who haven't. Mara does not understand why the laughter was the response. The thing she said was real. She felt its reality in the deep, certain way she feels everything. But the room treated it as strange, or as excessive, or as simply not worth taking seriously. She adjusts. Children always do. She begins to feel her way through the gap between what she knows internally to be true and what the social world is willing to receive. And in that gap, quietly, without any formal announcement, a fracture opens between her authentic self and the mask she will spend the next decade learning to wear. It was Aron who documented how often highly sensitive children receive the message that their sensitivity is a problem to be solved rather than a quality to be developed. The phrase most of them hear in one form or another is, "You are too sensitive." And for the INFP child, that message does not land lightly. It lands as a verdict, not about behavior, but about being. Now add to this the extraverted intuition. NE as auxiliary function means the INFP's interior richness is constantly being cross-referenced against the external field of possibility. Every conversation branches into a dozen imagined conversations. Every choice illuminates a constellation of unchosen alternatives. Every experience is simultaneously being lived and being observed for its patterns, its meanings, its connections to everything else. This is not overthinking, that is a reduction. This is NE operating at full capacity, a function that perceives the world as a field of interlocking possibilities rather than a sequence of discrete events. The result is a mind that is never quite fully present in the conventional sense, because it is simultaneously present in too many possible versions of the present. And that particular quality, that simultaneous depth of feeling and breadth of perception, is precisely what makes the INFP both extraordinary and genuinely difficult to be. Now we arrive at the emotional core of the story. Because everything described above, the FI, the NE, the value congruence, the sensitivity, the richness of the inner world, all of it converges to produce a single defining experience, the experience of feeling like an alien in one's own culture. Let us be precise about what this experience actually is. It is not shyness. It is not social anxiety, though those may accompany it. It is not depression, though it can look like depression from the outside. It is something more specific and in some ways more difficult to address. The experience of carrying a form of perception and a quality of interiority that the surrounding culture does not have adequate language for. Most INFPs cannot fully translate what they experience internally into words, not because they lack intelligence, often the opposite, but because their inner experience is pre-verbal, symbolic, and non-linear. FI does not produce neat propositions. It produces something more like weather, vast, patterned, internally coherent, but resistant to the kind of linear articulation that conversation requires. The INFP often knows something deeply, completely, with their whole being, and then opens their mouth and finds that the knowing has become approximate. Something essential has been lost in the move from inner to outer. The translation is imperfect, and it is always imperfect. This creates what might be called the translation problem, the INFP's lifelong challenge of converting their depth of perception into a form the external world can receive without diminishing it. The tragedy is not that the INFP has nothing to say, it is that what they have to say resists the medium through which saying must occur. But the translation problem alone does not explain the full weight of the alien experience. There is a second dimension, structural cultural mismatch. Sociologist David Reisman in The Lonely Crowd, 1950, introduced a distinction that remains one of the most useful frameworks in all of social psychology. He described two fundamental orientations of character. The inner-directed person, whose behavior is guided by internal values installed early in life, a kind of internal gyroscope, he called it, and the other-directed person, whose behavior is continuously calibrated against the responses of their social environment. Reisman argued that post-war American culture was undergoing a massive shift from inner direction to other direction, driven by urbanization, mass media, and the expansion of consumer culture. The INFP is, in Reisman's framework, radically inner-directed. Their behavior emerges from the inside outward. Their values are not borrowed from the room they are in, they are carried in from before the room existed. They do not consult the social environment to determine what to feel, what to believe, or what to want. They already know. The external world is not their gyroscope, it is their audience, and the world they are performing for has become, over the past 70 years, increasingly other-directed. Western post-industrial culture, particularly the productivity-oriented, metrics-driven, output-focused culture that now shapes most professional and social environments, rewards the opposite of what INFPs naturally do: speed over depth, output over process, measurability over meaning. The decision made in the meeting is the decision that can be defended with numbers, not the decision that honors something the room has not yet found a way to quantify. Picture an adult INFP, let us call him Daniel, sitting in a weekly project review at a mid-sized technology company. The meeting is moving fast. The vocabulary is the vocabulary of efficiency, conversion rates, sprint velocity, deliverable timelines. Daniel has something he wants to say. He has perceived something, a pattern in the customer feedback, a quality in the user experience that the metrics are not capturing, and he knows it matters. He can feel its importance with the full certainty of FI. But the room is in a language that will receive what he has to say. Not because the room is hostile, because the room is operating in an entirely different register of reality. And so Daniel says something approximate, or Daniel says nothing. And on the drive home, he sits with the particular fatigue of having been present for hours in a place where no part of him was really present at all. This is the cultural mismatch, not dramatic, not traumatic, just the steady, accumulating erosion of a person who has never been given a context in which their most natural capacities are the ones that are needed. The popular framing is that INFPs need to come out of their shell, that the work is to become more articulate, more assertive, more adapted to the demands of the world as it is. This advice is not just unhelpful, it's a category error. The INFP shell is not a defense mechanism, it's a cathedral, and you don't renovate a cathedral by lowering the ceiling. Which brings us to the specific psychological traps. Not character flaws, not failures of will, but predictable consequences of living with INFP architecture in a world not built to accommodate it. The first is what might be called authenticity paralysis. INFPs possess such a refined and rigorously maintained internal value system that the fear of acting inauthentically, of doing something that betrays what they actually believe, can prevent them from acting at all. This is not laziness. Laziness is the absence of motivation. What the INFP experiences is an excess of it. So many competing moral considerations, so much awareness of what each available action would cost in terms of inner integrity, that the cognitive and emotional load of choosing becomes genuinely overwhelming. James Hollis, in Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life, 2005, writes about the way the psyche can become trapped between what the ego has been told it should want and what the deeper self actually requires. For the INFP, this tension is constant, pervasive, and largely invisible to the people around them. The second trap is depth addiction. Because the INFP's interior world is so vivid, so richly populated with meaning and beauty and imagined connection, the external world often feels thin by comparison. Not ugly, not unwelcome, thin, like stepping from a fully lit room into a corridor where the bulbs are 40 watts. The imagined conversation with a fictional character carries more emotional truth than many real conversations. The novel read alone on a Sunday afternoon feels more like genuine communion than the dinner party attended that Saturday night. This is not misanthropy. The INFP does not dislike people, but the contrast between the richness of the interior and the comparative poverty of most social exchange creates a gravitational pull inward that grows stronger with each disappointment. The third trap is perhaps the most physically exhausting. Judith Orloff, in The Empath's Survival Guide, 2017, makes a distinction that cuts to the heart of what many INFPs experience in their relationships with others. Having empathy, she writes, means your heart goes out to another person. But for those she calls empaths, a category that maps closely to the FI-dominant INFP, it goes much further. We actually feel others' emotions, energy, and physical symptoms in our own bodies without the usual defenses that most people have. The INFP does not merely understand pain, they temporarily become it. They absorb the emotional state of the person across from them with such completeness that distinguishing their own feeling from the borrowed one requires active, effortful attention. In a crowd, this can produce a kind of psychic noise that is genuinely debilitating. In a relationship, it means the INFP is always, in some sense, carrying two people's emotional weight. The boundary between self and other becomes permeable. And when the external emotional environment is chaotic or painful, the INFP's interior, that carefully tended cathedral, fills with someone else's weather. But the deepest trap, the one that does the most lasting damage, is what deserves a precise name: internalized illegitimacy. It is the belief, arrived at slowly through accumulated evidence, that one's natural way of experiencing the world is a defect rather than a design. Think of someone, let us call her Nora, who is 29 years old and has spent the last decade being extremely good at not being herself. She learned it gradually. First in school, where intellectual restlessness was labeled as distraction, then in her first job, where her need for meaning in her work was interpreted as impracticality, then in her relationships, where her depth of feeling was received as intensity and her need for solitude as withholding. She adapted at each stage. She learned the language of the rooms she was in. She developed what psychologists call a social persona, a functional presentation of self that allowed her to move through the world with less friction. And she was good at it, impressively good. But somewhere around her 29th year, she woke up one morning and had the quiet, devastating realization that she could no longer locate with any certainty where the performance ended and the person began. The adaptation had been so thorough, so sustained, and so professionally executed that she had, in the most literal possible sense, lost track of herself. Not dramatically, not in crisis, in the way that a photograph fades, slowly, uniformly, until the original colors are only approximate memories. This is the trap the title of this video is pointing at. Not the alienness itself. The alienness is simply a structural reality of being an INFP in a world not designed around them. The trap is what happens when the alienness goes unnamed and unaddressed for long enough that the person begins to agree with the culture's verdict about their own nature. And yet, the same architecture that produces these traps, that exact same cognitive structure, also confers capacities that are genuinely rare. Not in the motivational poster sense, in the precise psychological sense that these capacities emerge from the INFP's specific cognitive wiring and are difficult or impossible to access without it. The first is moral depth. Phi-dominant individuals have access to a level of ethical nuance that most cognitive architectures do not reach naturally. They do not simply apply rules to situations, they feel the contradictions within the rules themselves. They notice where a principle that is correct in most cases causes harm in this specific case. They carry the complexity of the human situation in their nervous system rather than processing it at arm's length. This makes INFPs extraordinary ethical thinkers, advocates, and artists, not because they are nicer than other people, but because their moral processing occurs at a finer resolution. The great humanist writers, those who could hold the full weight of a single human life without reducing it to a lesson, often carried this profile. The therapist who truly sees the patient across from them, rather than the diagnosis. The activist who refuses to let the cause devour the individual. These are not accidental expressions of temperament, they are expressions of FI operating at its highest register. The second gift is pattern recognition across human experience. The combination of introverted feeling and extraverted intuition creates a perceptual capacity that is genuinely unusual. The ability to see patterns across human stories, emotional realities, and cultural moments that are invisible to more sequential, analytical types of mind. NE constantly generates connections. FI continuously evaluates their meaning. The result is a form of wisdom that arrives not through research, but through deep, continuous attentiveness to the texture of human experience. Many of the greatest novelists, poets, and humanitarian leaders in recorded history appear to have operated from this architecture. Not all INFPs create great art, but the capacity for the kind of empathic pattern recognition that great art requires is structurally embedded in the INFP's cognitive design. The third gift is perhaps the most intimate. When an INFP finally decides to trust someone, when they open the gates of that carefully protected interior, the quality of connection they offer is unlike what most people have ever experienced. They are not performing warmth. The INFP is constitutionally incapable of performing warmth in any sustained way. Their authenticity function is too precise, too unforgiving of pretense. What they give completely. When they love, the love is not strategic or provisional or calibrated to social expectation. It is the full, unguarded transmission of an interior world that they have shared with almost no one. This is precious, genuinely, irreplaceably precious, and most people who receive it do not fully understand what they have received. Abraham Maslow, in Motivation and Personality, 1954, described self-actualized individuals as those who had integrated their full nature, including the parts that culture found inconvenient, into a coherent, authentic way of being. He described them as having a quality he called being love, a capacity for connection that is not need-based, not transactional, not anxious, but simply generative and real. The INFP's architecture, when it is developed rather than suppressed, when the interior life is trusted rather than apologized for, moves naturally toward that quality. The common assumption about sensitive people is that they need to develop thicker skin, that resilience means armoring against feeling, that depth is a liability in a world that moves this fast. That's not just wrong, it's precisely backwards. Sensitivity, properly understood, is not a wound waiting to be toughened. It is a precision instrument waiting to be aimed. The INFP who has learned to inhabit their own architecture, who has stopped apologizing for their depth and started directing it, is not more fragile than the person who has learned not to feel. They are more accurate, more awake, and in all the ways that ultimately matter, more useful to the world. So what does the path forward look like? Not as prescription, not as a set of techniques, but as a genuine philosophical reframe. Carl Jung spent the second half of his career developing what he called the theory of individuation, the lifelong process of becoming the fullest, most integrated version of oneself. It is not a comfortable process. Jung was explicit about this. Individuation requires a willingness to encounter and integrate the shadow, the parts of the self that have been denied, repressed, or exiled because they were inconvenient to one's social identity or cultural context. For the INFP, the shadow often includes precisely the things the world has told them are defects: the depth, the sensitivity, the need for meaning, the refusal to settle for surfaces. Individuation for the INFP means learning to treat their interior world as data rather than distraction. Not as something to be disciplined or overcome, but as a legitimate source of knowledge, rigorous, consistent, and often more accurate than the consensus of the room. There is also what Jungian typologists call the inferior function. For the INFP, whose dominant function is introverted feeling, the inferior, the function that operates least consciously, that appears least developed, is extraverted thinking, or T. T is the function of external structure, logical organization, and efficient execution. The INFP's relationship with T is often fraught. When underdeveloped, it creates the very paralysis and disconnection between inner richness and outer expression that produces so much of the INFP's suffering. When gradually integrated, not as a replacement for FI, but as a complement to it, T gives the INFP's extraordinary inner world a form that the external world can actually receive. This is the developmental task. Not to become more extroverted, more pragmatic, more adapted to the culture's preferences, but to build the expressive and structural capacities that allow the interior world to act in the world, to move from insight to expression, from perception to form. James Hollis writes in Finding Meaning in the Second Half of Life that personal authority, authentic selfhood, is the humble acknowledgement of what wishes to come into being through you. Not what your parents needed you to be, not what your workplace rewards, not what the culture tells you is reasonable or realistic, but what the deepest layer of your own nature is pressing toward. If the ego does not step out of the way of that energy, Hollis writes, the energy will trample us in pathological outbreaks, where something vital within us will die, even though our bodies may keep on moving for decades. For the INFP, that vital thing, the thing that dies when the performance replaces the person, is the very quality that makes them who they are. The depth, the authenticity, the unwillingness to mistake efficiency for meaning. The integrated INFP does not pretend to be something they are not. They build a life, slowly, deliberately, sometimes against significant resistance, whose structures support rather than suppress their nature. They choose work that requires meaning, not just productivity. They cultivate relationships that can bear depth, not just sociability. They develop over years the capacity to translate their inner world into the outer one with increasing fidelity, not by simplifying the interior, but by becoming more skilled in the act of translation. This is not a quick process. It is not a weekend workshop or a journaling practice or a dietary change. It is the work of a life. But it is the specific work that the INFP's architecture is, in some deep sense, built for. You have been watching this for some time now. And if you are an INFP, or if you have spent your life adjacent to one, loving one, wondering at the particular quality of their presence in their pain, then you know that what has been described here is not abstract. You know what it is to sit in a room full of people and feel simultaneously that you are perceiving something important about every person in that room and that you are completely invisible to all of them. You know the particular loneliness of having so much to say in so few contexts in which the saying is welcome. You know the exhaustion of carrying other people's pain as though it were your own, because for you, it often is. You know what it costs to maintain the performance of normalcy over years and decades, and you know the strange grief that comes with discovering how much of yourself was paid as the price. But I want to say something to you directly, and I want you to hear it as the precision it is intended to be. Your interior world, that cathedral you have been protecting and apologizing for and occasionally abandoning in desperation, is not a symptom. It is not an excess. It is not a problem that the right therapist or the right relationship or the right routine will eventually solve. It is the primary fact of who you are. It is where you live. And its existence, its extraordinary richness, its unwillingness to be simplified or commodified or made to fit the available containers, these are not malfunctions of your psychology. They are its most essential features. The alienness you have felt, that persistent, bone-deep sense of operating on a different frequency than the people around you, is not evidence of damage. It is evidence of design. You were built for a kind of engagement with reality that most people do not attempt and most cultures do not reward. That is genuinely difficult. The difficulty is real, and it would be dishonest to minimize it. But difficulty and defect are not the same thing. Elaine Aron spent years establishing in formal research what many INFPs have known experientially their entire lives, that the heightened sensitivity, the depth of processing, the intensity of inner experience is not a pathology, but a trait, ancient, adaptive, and present in roughly 15 to 20% of all known species. It has persisted because it serves a function, because a community that contains people who perceive at this depth, who refuse to accept the simplified version of events, who insist on the moral complexity of things, that community is richer and more navigable than one without them. The world did not misplace you. It received you without understanding what it had received. That is a distinction worth holding on to. You have spent years, perhaps, trying to understand why you are the way you are, why the things that seem effortless to others require such translation, why the things that seem effortless to you barely register for others. And perhaps there was a time when that question arrived with shame attached to it, as though the answer might confirm the verdict the culture had already seemed to render. But the question, asked with honesty and without apology, leads somewhere entirely different. It leads to the recognition that you are not a failed version of something common. You are a rare and complete version of something uncommon. The architecture of your mind, the FI that constructs meaning from the inside outward, the NE that perceives possibility in every surface, the sensitivity that makes the world loud and real and sometimes overwhelming, is not a glitch in an otherwise standard system. It is the system. It is the whole and specific thing that you are. And the work ahead, not the work of fixing yourself, but the work of inhabiting yourself, is among the most important and most difficult things a person can undertake. Not because it will make you more palatable to the world, it may in some ways make you less so, but because it is the only form of living that will feel, in the deepest and most honest register, like actually living. Hollis writes that to become a person does not mean to be well-adjusted, well-adapted, approved of by others. It means to become who you are. There is a kind of simplicity in that formulation that is almost shocking given how hard the thing itself turns out to be. To become who you are, not who you were shaped to perform, not who the room needed you to be, not the approximation that caused the least disruption. The person who was there before the adjustments, before the fractures, before the translation going the wrong direction from inside out instead of outside in. That person is still present. They have always been present. Quiet, perhaps, layered over, but not gone. Never gone. The alien feeling is real, but aliens, it turns out, are not from nowhere. They come from somewhere specific, somewhere with its own gravity, its own light, its own language. The distance was never a measure of how far you had fallen. It was always a measure of how far you had come. You were never too much for the world. The world was simply not yet fluent in you.